Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 22, The Glorious Revolution. Last time we discussed the growing problems in the relationship between Massachusetts and England. Massachusetts refused to obey English laws and was posing a threat to English trade. After Massachusetts spent several decades refusing to make any real concessions to English demands, King Charles, acting through the Lords of Trade, finally made an attack on Massachusetts' charter, which was the legal basis for all their defiance. The charter was successfully annulled, but shortly thereafter Charles died. His brother, James II, became king, and he took Charles's colonial policies even further. Not only did Massachusetts lose its charter, so did the other New England colonies. In fact, all of the colonies disappeared altogether, absorbed into the Dominion of New England, which eventually grew to encompass New York and New Jersey as well. The Dominion was much less democratic than the previous New England colonies had been. There was no elected legislature, and the independence of the towns was severely curtailed. There was an advisory council, but in practice the Dominion was ruled by one man, Governor Edmund Andros. He was proving to be very unpopular, but there didn't seem to be any way to directly challenge him. Today, we're going to look at how the Dominion of New England fell completely apart after only a few years of existence. The collapse of the Dominion was sparked by the so-called Glorious Revolution in England. Actually, the rebellion against the Dominion was just one of several rebellions which occurred in the colonies thanks to the Glorious Revolution. So in order to understand the following events in American history, we once again need to jump back to England. Let me start by very briefly recapping English history during the period of colonization. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and because she was childless, she was succeeded by her relative James I, who was also King of Scotland, thus unifying England, Scotland, and Ireland under the Stuart dynasty. James lived until 1625, and he was followed by his son Charles I. Charles was an inept ruler, and his bumbling and his hostility towards the English Parliament provoked civil war in the 1640s. This war, which divided the country on political and religious lines, ended in a victory for Parliament and the Puritans, and with the execution of Charles in 1649. For the next decade, Britain was ruled as a republic, under the de facto dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. But Cromwell was never able to hammer out a stable political order, and after his death everything promptly fell apart. Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had been living in exile, returned to England and easily took back control, putting the Stuart dynasty back on the throne and Parliament back in its place. Well, actually, Parliament was still far more powerful than it had been before the Civil War. They now firmly controlled the finances of the realm. It would have been inconceivable for Charles II to try to rule without Parliament the way his father had. Parliament was still developing as an institution, of course, and it hadn't reached anything like its modern form. There were no prime ministers, for instance, nor was there a party system, although politics was divided into factions. Charles did what he could to get around Parliament. You'll recall that he didn't call for new elections for almost 2 decades, because his current Parliament was pretty subservient. He even took bribes from the French king, Louis XIV, to try to get some financial independence, but it wasn't enough. Even surrounded by loyalists, he was hamstrung. Charles didn't prove to be an especially interested or capable or steady-handed ruler, but things still held together. We've already heard about the mostly unsuccessful wars against the Dutch. But despite those failures, the economy was booming. By 1685, the English had the largest merchant fleet in the world, and a burgeoning middle class was buying exotic goods previously reserved for the elite. Stability had returned to the realm, but already there were new problems looming. You see, the Stuarts had long been supporters of the Anglican Church in all its formal and hierarchical glory. That is, they supported the parts of the Church which seemed most Catholic. They were often suspected of having Catholic sympathies, and not without reason. Charles II was taken into the Catholic Church on his deathbed, and his brother James had openly converted to Catholicism. The conversion of James in particular posed major problems for England. You see, Charles II had no legitimate children, and so James was next in line for the throne. It seemed like England would have a Catholic king, a frightening prospect. Many prominent leaders, including the Earl of Shaftesbury, one of the founders of Carolina, agitated and schemed to make one of Charles's illegitimate sons heir to the throne, but to no avail. The king had no interest in changing the rules of succession. Charles died in 1685, and his brother did in fact succeed him. James, now King James II, did what he could to promote the Catholic faith, reintroducing monastic orders and appointing Catholic officials, although he was limited by Parliament and by the hostility of the nation as a whole. But for a little while at least, tensions remained manageable. However, the birth of a child changed all that. You see, when he became king, James had two daughters, Mary and Anne. Both Mary and Anne had been raised as Protestants on the order of Charles II. Therefore, even if James himself was a Catholic, his successors would be Protestants. Thus, although the English were wary about having a Catholic king, they could at least rest assured that the throne would return to Protestants. But that was all upended when, in 1688, James's second wife gave birth to a son, also named James. For Protestants, this was a disaster. Being male, the young James now jumped ahead of his half-sisters in the order of succession, and he would certainly be raised as a Catholic. His godfathers were literally Louis XIV and the Pope. All of a sudden, England and Scotland faced the frightening prospect of being ruled by Catholics for the foreseeable future. Would English Protestantism be saved? Would anyone come to their rescue? In fact, yes. Now, Mary, the eldest of James's daughters, had been married to her cousin William of Orange since 1677. Who was William of Orange? William was the leader of the Dutch Republic. He held a basically hereditary position known as stadtholder. He was also Captain General for life of the Dutch army, and that meant that William was constantly struggling against the French, who were the biggest foes of the Dutch Republic. In fact, William was pretty monomaniacally focused on keeping the French out. It was his one big political aim in life. As we talked about during the episodes on New York, the Netherlands were also rivals of England, and they had fought 3 wars over the last few decades. And the English kings had been trying to align themselves with France, much to the unhappiness of their Protestant subjects. So the dissatisfaction in England presented a big opportunity for William, who actually had some claim on the English throne as a grandson of Charles I. So he'd been watching and waiting, seeing if events might play out to his advantage. If he could take over England, then he could reverse England's pro-French, anti-Dutch foreign policy. He didn't really want to control England for its own sake. All he was interested in was getting England on the Dutch Republic's side. Everything else was incidental to that goal. By the time James's son was born, he was preparing an invasion force. All of a sudden, his intentions became clear to everyone. James tried to rally support to fight William, but to his growing horror, he found that he had basically no allies in Britain at all. Hardly anyone was even willing to condemn the forthcoming invasion verbally. Realizing his precarious position, James frantically tried to undo all his pro-Catholic policies and reach out to his opponents, but it was too little too late. William landed in the southwest of England that November with over 20,000 men. It might have been possible for James to stop him, but the king was panicking, losing control of both himself and his men. He was literally having a mental breakdown. His daughter Mary was waging a war against him, and his other daughter Anne soon defected as well. Facing desertions and rebellions, James fled back to London. He now had no supporters. The war was lost, and he had never even faced the enemy. William marched towards London, and James soon fled to France, where he would spend the rest of his life. Then, basically, a new parliament was elected, which declared that James fleeing the country meant that he had effectively abdicated as king. They then offered the throne to William and Mary, who became co-monarchs. This was by no means the legal thing to do, but sometimes armies and the national will trump legalities. Parliament also drafted a Bill of Rights. This wasn't exactly like a modern Bill of Rights. It wasn't primarily concerned with the rights of the individual. It was more about limiting the rights of the monarchy while strengthening Parliament. For example, it was declared illegal for the king to suspend laws without the consent of Parliament, raise money without the consent of Parliament, maintain a standing army in times of peace without the consent of Parliament, interfere with trials and elections, or inflict, quote, illegal and cruel punishments. There were a few individual rights discussed, the right to petition the king and the freedom from excessive bail, but those were also more about limiting the powers of the king than about individualism. Eventually, the Bill of Rights would be seen as a cornerstone of the British Constitution, but at the time it was mostly just a justification for the overthrow of James. This whole sequence of events became known as the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it had been accomplished with such little fuss and violence, at least in England, though it did lead to a major rebellion in Ireland. So what was the Glorious Revolution? Was it a blow against tyranny? Well, maybe if you squint. I mean, James was the one pushing for religious tolerance for both Catholics and dissenting Protestants. But he was also trying to bypass Parliament and rig elections. And it's not like William himself invaded in order to protect English liberties. He just wanted to flip England from pro-French to anti-French. English domestic politics were unimportant to him, just a hassle that he had to deal with. It arguably wasn't even a revolution. In the words of James Trussell Adams, quote, "There had been no change in the governing class. There had been no increase in democratic influences. The essentials of free government had not been mentioned in the Bill of Rights. There had been no increase in religious liberty, in public education, in the freedom of trade or of the press, nor in the publicity of debates in Parliament. Power had indeed been transferred from the king to Parliament, but not to the people." End quote. The real revolution was not the Glorious Revolution itself, but the increasing powers of Parliament over time. I mean, the independence of the monarchy had been declining for decades, but the Glorious Revolution definitely moved things forward. Charles II and James II had both tried to at least keep Parliament under their thumb, even if they couldn't do without it entirely, but even that was no longer an option. Parliament was finally meeting regularly and really taking charge of policy. Parliament now had a say in the appointment of all high officials. The monarchy will still have some power in the decades to come, but its independence is now ever diminishing. Certainly a big contrast with the growing absolutism of Louis XIV in France. These changes would of course have a big impact on American political thought as well, as we'll see over the next God knows how many episodes. Arguably, though, from here on out, English and American styles of government diverge more and more, as England creates the first real parliamentary government and America moves towards a presidential system. In England, the rise of Parliament meant that the nominal head of state, the monarch, was marginalized, and the real authority came from men selected by Parliament itself. On the other hand, in America, the governors, who were the local equivalents of the monarch, never actually totally lost their independence. The executive branch retained authority separate from the authority of the legislature, and that's true in America even today. You don't need to look at abstract political theories to explain it, you can just look at the different ways these institutions developed. But that's all in the future. Let's get back to the Glorious Revolution and its impact on New England. Before William had actually launched his invasion, the Puritans had sent a delegation to London, led by Increase Mather. Mather was a very important figure in New England at this time. He was the son of an influential minister and a minister himself, as well as the father of Cotton Mather, yet another minister as well as a writer. The Mather family were generally hardline Puritans who wanted to avoid any softening of the faith. They'll pop up again, but for now we'll focus on Increase Mather's delegation to England. The goal of the delegation was to get as many concessions from James as possible. Most of all, they wanted the Dominion of New England to be granted an assembly. In exchange, they would guarantee enough money to fund the Dominion's government. However, the Lords of Trade refused to give in on all but a few minor demands. The bigger demands never even reached the king's desk. Really, the case was hopeless with James on the throne. But then, revolution. In just a few short months, everything changed. The Catholic James was gone, and the defenders of Protestantism, William and Mary, took his place. The New England delegation realized that they should be more ambitious in their aims. So they sent their new monarchs a petition, not just asking for the creation of an assembly, but for the end of the Dominion altogether, and the restoration of the original colonies. Their petition was put before the Lords of Trade. Now, the Lords of Trade were more open to reform than they had been, but this was still going too far for them. After all, there were sound reasons for the creation of the Dominion. It wasn't just about punishing the Puritans, it was also about making New England militarily defensible and about cutting costs. So the Lords agreed to recall Governor Andros and look into further changes, but not to scrap the Dominion. And William personally was no great reformer or anything. He was just a pragmatist bent on fighting France. So he wasn't going to go out of his way to secure the rights of New Englanders. It looked like the Dominion might be here to stay after all, even if the colonists could talk the king into making it less autocratic. Back in New England, word of William's invasion had been gradually trickling in throughout early 1689. Governor Andros had spent the winter leading troops against some Indians up in Maine, but when word reached him that April, he hurried back to Boston. He tried to suppress news of the invasion from spreading, but to no avail. Excitement and unease rippled throughout New England. No one knew what was happening, just that it was big. Even Andros had no idea what he was supposed to do. The new government in England had been sending instructions to the various colonial governors, but not to Andros. They still weren't sure what they were going to do with the Dominion, so the Lords of Trade held off on sending instructions, which just had the effect of further increasing uncertainty in New England. On the other hand, Increase Mather was sending word back to New England, but not to Andros. No, he was sending word back to his fellow Puritans so that they were aware of the situation, and aware that the Dominion's position had been weakened. However, the Dominion was not brought down by King William, by Increase Mather, or by the Puritan elite in Boston. Actually, it was thanks to common soldiers. When Andros had left Maine, he kept some soldiers stationed on the frontier. Well, some of those troops mutinied and marched on Boston. It soon became clear to everyone that some sort of trouble was brewing. While the mutineers were still on their way, some of the leading men of Boston met to decide what to do. Many of them favored waiting for further word from England before taking any big steps, but they were aware that things could get out of hand regardless of what they favored. The people had a will of their own, after all. So it was better to be prepared to take charge if rebellion did in fact break out, rather than letting the mob control everything. To that end, they drafted a declaration justifying rebellion, should such a rebellion actually happen. Well, it did. The mutineers arrived in Boston on April 17th, and the next day they assembled a force of 1,000 men from the local militias. They began arresting Dominion officials, including Governor Andros and Edward Randolph, that constant irritant who kept poking his nose in New England's affairs. Meanwhile, seeing which way the wind was blowing, the, quote, leaders of the colony issued their statement justifying this revolt as a righteous attack on tyranny in the name of the king. Within 2 days, all of the forts around Boston had been taken and the leaders of the Dominion were imprisoned. It was all technically bloodless, although the rebels did hold a gun to Randolph's head at one point to get him to cooperate. Pretty much all of the colonists supported the rebellion, so there was little dissent or unrest, at least in the early days. However, although there was agreement about getting rid of the Dominion, there was less agreement about what should come next. Colonists published political pamphlets at a fast pace. Mostly they were calling for a return to the way things had been before, but there were a few notable changes. For one thing, people were arguing for a broadening of the franchise to include at least some landowners and not just Puritans. For another thing, the arguments weren't just being phrased in terms of obedience to God, they were also being framed in terms of popular welfare. Clearly, appeals to Puritanism were no longer sufficient to win debates. But the big question was what to do about the government. Most people wanted to declare the old charter of Massachusetts restored and act like the last few years had just never happened. On the other hand, the leadership was more cautious. They didn't want to undermine their negotiating position with England by jumping the gun. In this case, the leadership won out. In fact, these self-declared leaders were doing what they could to stay in charge. They formed a temporary government, called the, quote, Council for the Safety of the People and Conservation of the Peace. But there was considerable unhappiness with this usurpation of power, so the council soon decided to call for an election, for a convention which would then decide how to proceed. The towns duly held elections with an expanded franchise, and the convention then duly met. The first meeting was inconclusive, but a second convention was held a few weeks later, and there it was agreed that the, quote, method of settlement of the government in this present juncture lieth wholly in the voice of the people, at least until such time as further instructions came from England. For now, the will of the people was that the old pre-Dominion system be put back in place. Even the old officials who had been in office a few years ago would be restored to their posts. This didn't mean that the old charter was officially back in effect, just that it was, in practice, back in effect. The legal status of everything was purposefully left open. Town governments were restored as well, and the towns mostly just continued on as normal, with the same officials from before. As for the other colonies, Plymouth and Rhode Island resumed their old governments with little fuss. Connecticut, which had a similar division between moderates and hardliners as in Massachusetts, took a little longer, but it too restored the old charter government. New Hampshire, on the other hand, tried to form a temporary government, but internal disagreements and the external threat of Indian invasion pushed them to request annexation by Massachusetts, to which the larger colony agreed. But for the most part, everything had de facto gone back to the way it was before. We'll talk more about what happened in New York and New Jersey later. For now, all you need to know is that there was a rebellion against the Dominion there as well. New York could have sent a force up to Boston to try to free Governor Andros, with a high chance of success, but the leaders there dithered and made excuses, and so the New England insurgents remained in power. The new government of Massachusetts sent word of their rebellion to King William in May, as did the other colonies, hoping that he would confirm their actions after the fact. However, it took a while for England to send word back to America. The king was annoyed by the whole thing, but New England wasn't especially important to him. But finally, in December, the colonies received instructions from England. The restored governments were to remain in power for now, pending a final decision from the king. This was only a temporary authorization, but it still meant that the old colonies had been effectively restored, since it was unlikely that the king would go to the trouble of recreating the Dominion after all this upset. What Increase Mather and the other diplomats had failed to do through negotiation, the colonists had achieved through force. And finally, Andros, Randolph, and the other prisoners were all shipped back to England. Andros faced trial for his actions, but he was able to rebut all the charges the colonists made against him, by pointing out that those actions had all been explicitly authorized by his instructions from the king. And despite his failure in New England, he'd be back in America just a few years later, serving as governor of Maryland and Virginia. Even with the Dominion gone, politics in Massachusetts remained divided into two main factions: the moderates, who were centered in port cities like Boston and who had more dealings with England, and the hardliners, who tended to live further out in the country. The hardliners were still the majority, and they were again increasing their power. Nevertheless, the terms of debate had shifted. Now most everyone agreed with the need to come to some sort of terms with England. Even the people who wanted things to go back to the way they were before acknowledged that things wouldn't exactly go back to the way they were before. There was another important change to note. Events were being driven more by the people as a whole than by the colony's leadership. Back during the founding of Massachusetts, the government had been pretty top-down, with the governor and magistrates taking the lead on most important issues. There was still pushback from the colonists, but it was less common. Now, however, it's the people who are taking the lead and the magistrates and other leaders who are being forced to follow. The leadership is in a difficult position. Without the charter, they don't really have anything in the way of legitimate authority outside of popular support. Their power had been upended, and all they could do was try to balance between the demands of the people for restoration of the charter and the need to appease England. Both Massachusetts and Connecticut extended the right to vote to all those men who had paid a certain amount in taxes and were certified to be, quote, not vicious in life. In Massachusetts, members of Puritan churches could still become freemen even without paying enough in taxes, but still this was a notable shift. The franchise was being extended to non-Puritans by the government willingly, rather than being forced to do so by English demands. In Massachusetts, some 700 people became freemen under the new law, a considerable increase in a colony with only 50,000 people in it. All of these changes were taking place while the colonists anxiously waited for the word from England, but nothing was forthcoming. Because of delays and setbacks in Parliament, they still hadn't decided what to do with New England. Meanwhile, the provisional government of Massachusetts was having a hard time of it. They had trouble getting people to pay taxes and so suffered from a shortage of funds. They also went back on a promise to extend the franchise to more citizens. And they also had military problems. You see, the Glorious Revolution hadn't brought peace to Britain. Quite the opposite. When King William took the throne, he took England into an anti-French coalition with the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire. So almost immediately England became embroiled in what would become known as the 9 Years' War, or as King William's War in America. Therefore, the colonies were now at war with the French in Quebec, yet another way in which New England was being drawn into the wider world against its will. This was the first of a series of wars between the British and the French over control of North America, which would last until the French were forced off the continent altogether in 1763. But it must be said this first encounter went pretty badly for the English. After the Revolution, most of the troops in Maine had retreated back to Massachusetts, leaving the frontier unguarded. The Indians, encouraged by Jesuit missionaries, took this as a sign of weakness and stepped up their attacks. In fall 1689, the French and Indians successfully took Pemaquid, one of the most important forts in Maine. To respond to the threat, the colonies tried to recreate the New England Confederation, that military alliance which had formed in the wake of the Pequot War, but the attempt fell apart almost immediately. In general, all the military efforts were being poorly coordinated. As I'll talk about next episode, a joint invasion of Quebec with New York turned into a disaster. These failures made it more likely that the Dominion would be restored, since that would bring unity to the military strategy of the region, and serious thought was given to the idea, even after everything that had happened. However, in the end it was not to be. In 1691, 2 years after the overthrow of the Dominion, King William finally agreed to restore the charters of the various colonies and give them back their independence. Well, something like that anyway. William wasn't just going to let things go back the way they were. There were going to be major changes in Massachusetts. Instead of restoring the old charter, Massachusetts would be given a new one which fixed many of the issues with the first one. The governor would be appointed by the king. The council would also no longer be elected. Instead, the elected lower house of the General Court would nominate members to the council, subject to the governor's veto. Freedom of religion was granted to non-Catholics and the religious restrictions on voting were eliminated, opening the government to non-Puritans, or at least those non-Puritans with a bit of wealth. Basically, a bunch of changes that would bring the colony into line with how things are done outside of New England. Massachusetts protested all this, but to no avail. They were in no real position to bargain. And so, willing or not, Massachusetts was now a royal colony, directly under the king's authority. This was basically a compromise between how the New England Puritans wanted it and how the king wanted it. England now had more control over New England, but the control was hardly as total as it had been under the Dominion. Everyone was disappointed, but everyone could live with it. After the Glorious Revolution, both sides were willing to moderate their demands. King William, unlike James, had no personal interest in the Dominion of New England, and the New Englanders, having been effectively subjugated through legal means, now had a much weaker bargaining position, and so a compromise could be reached. However, the Lords of Trade made one omission that would become of crucial importance later. They failed to provide funds for a salary for the governor. That meant that the governor would only get paid if the General Court agreed to pay him. Obviously, this gave the Assembly considerable leverage over the governors. They could basically force them to resign. The end of the Dominion also meant an end to the strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Although future governors in Massachusetts would be royally appointed, they also had to contend with an uppity assembly, and so trade wound up less regulated than under the Dominion. As far as the other colonies go, Connecticut and Rhode Island, since they were smaller and less disruptive, were allowed to continue under their old charters with elected governors and all. New Hampshire was kept as an independent province, but Plymouth Colony was annexed to Massachusetts. The first of the New England colonies was no more. The home of the Pilgrims had been finally, totally absorbed by the Puritans. Rest in peace, Plymouth. Next episode will continue the story of the fall of the Dominion, with a look at how things went down in New York. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode at the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.